Okay. So maybe because we already have people watching and we have sort of limited time and there's so many of you and so many things to talk about, I might just start to welcome everybody and just to introduce the project a little bit, and Izzy can just join us when it's possible. So first of all, thank you so much to Jeannette and to our guests today for being with us for this discussion to mark Europe's Kitchen in Glasgow. So Europe's Kitchen is one of 5 cultural projects marking Germany's presidency of the Council of the European Union. And it's a kind of, for me, a very special project because it kind of gives Europe this more sensual dimension, which is often missing when we talk about Europe and everything connected with it. And the space of the kitchen has opened up possibilities to talk and exchange, which have been really beautiful and surprising. The project is one that I conceptualized with the Goethe-Institut and curated as well. And it involves 11 different artists from around Europe connecting with 11 different cities. Each artist is connected to one city and they collaborate with the local Goethe-Institut there and local citizens to create an event of some sort. These events have taken many different shapes. Glasgow is the 6th one in the series, and they will continue until December when the presidency ends. Of course, the challenge of coming together, exchanging and sharing has been particularly difficult because of the pandemic, but it's been really amazing to see how creatively artists have responded and the ways in which people have, the longing to exchange and connect has led to very unusual and special ways of getting together. Our talk today, this discussion, is also an expression of that. Europe's Kitchen in Glasgow has many different components to it. It actually started last week with the Soul Food Sisters preparing meals that were given out to various vulnerable members of the local community in Glasgow's East End. And their menu was inspired by their interactions with Jeannette's artwork, the video installations, which are now on the project website, which perhaps some of the viewers have already seen. And the food there is a starting point to talk about how we are together in Europe today and what needs to change or not. So Izzy will be telling us more about that later. One other element of that is this discussion here, which we thought of as our intellectual kitchen table. And we exchanged with Jeannette to think about who we could bring together to have a really stimulating and interesting discussion. And it's a little bit like one of those, you get asked that question often in cookery books, who would be your dream dinner guests? And we had a little bit the feeling that we managed to bring together a sort of dream table. So thank you so much for responding so generously. What the audience don't know yet is that all the participants here wrote something in response to Jeannette's artworks, and those will be published on the project website later. What you'll get today is an impression of their reflections, and we hope that you will go to the website later to read their responses in full, because they're really strong and beautiful responses, and it's really worthwhile taking the time to engage with them more fully. So even if this project is ostensibly connected to the European Union, it was always clear for us that for it to be really meaningful, Europe has to be considered in a wider sense, not just as a political union or as a geographical landmass, but as an entity that's inextricably linked to, indeed indebted to, the rest of the world. And the UK's departure from the EU somehow made doing an event in the country all the more vital and urgent, because if Europe's Kitchen is about anything, it's about affirming the different forms of togetherness, of recognition that transcend political realities and boundaries. And if Europe is to be a better functioning, more just and democratic space, it has to acknowledge and deal with its colonial past. This was something that was really clear to us when we were planning this project, and therefore we felt like this ability to engage with the past, to look at it in the face, and to deal with the consequences of that is an essential ingredient for the creation of an inclusive and more cohesive European community. And therefore, we were particularly thrilled when the Danish-Trinidadian multidisciplinary artist Jeannette Ehlers agreed to be part of Europe's Kitchen. For years now, she's been examining memory, race, heritage, and colonialism in different ways through video and performance, as well as sculpture and installation. And her work is characterized by a very personal and intimate approach, even as she points to collective historical loss and trauma. Thank you so much, Jeannette, for being part of our project and opening this other dimension onto thinking about Europe. I wonder if we could begin with you telling us a bit about the works which are available to see on the website and their particular resonance in this moment.
Thank you so much, Priya, and thank you so much, Goethe-Institut, for inviting me for this. And thank you so much for all the invited guests that you agreed to be part of this. I'm very grateful, and yeah, I hope we'll get a great discussion also. And thank you for all the listeners, viewers, or whatever, audience. Yeah, the pieces that I show on the website are 2 video pieces. One is actually made as a live performance to start off with, but then I created it also as a video piece. So the gaze, that was originally a live performance from a performance that I did a few years ago in a small theater in Copenhagen. It was a very small theater, only taking like 40 people or so. And I was invited to make like a larger performance project. So I made a performance in which I created different scenes, and the gaze was one of the scenes. And between each scene, I had a curtain, but it wasn't really like a curtain that you normally experience in a theater. It was more like a mirror. So the audience would actually look at themselves while we were having a stage exchange and stuff like that behind the stage. So when the curtain opened up again, the mirrors went away, then suddenly the stage was full of black performers, which is very rare in Denmark, because Denmark is really predominantly white. So then we had these, we were performing, and we were sitting for 4 minutes, just looking into the eyes of the audience for 4 minutes, just like in the video, but we didn't have music or anything. So it was really just silence, and then the gazes interacting. Then after 4 minutes, one of the performers, she would get up, she would go into the audience, and she would pick a random audience, and then they would swap seats. So now the performer who was on stage before, she would be in the audience, and the audience would be on stage. And then the performer, now being among the audience, would say, "I'm here because you were there." So she would create this atmosphere, or she would create this atmosphere of call and response, because after a little while, we on stage would say, "We're here because you were there." And that statement or quote is a very well-known quote. I heard Stuart Hall say it, but I also know that it's often used elsewhere. But it kind of made this very intense atmosphere in the space. So it's a little different. There are other dimensions to it when it's a live performance than when you see it, when you watch it as a video. But I still felt that it was a great opportunity to create a video that kind of mimicked that intensity that is in the video. So that's why I made it, and I made these close-up images of every single person in the group that is on display in the video. To create this confrontation. And then for the video, I took out our response as we're here because you were there. So the performer is only saying, I'm here because you were there. And then we kind of leave that open. So those are different ways of creating, of working around a piece. But yeah, I was very happy that I could show this piece right here, because I think it really speaks into what this whole event is about, and yeah, the difficulties and the challenges of Europe, Fortress Europe. So that is just a little sum up of what the gaze is about. The other piece is called Black is a Beautiful Word, I, and it more engages with the archive. The Royal Danish Library has a huge archive of records and images from the Virgin Islands, the former Danish Virgin Islands, the now US Virgin Islands. They're called St. Croix, St. Thomas, and St. John. And they have like a huge amount of great material that you can actually, it's digitized, so you can find it online. And I was once given a chance to deal with the archive and to use images from the archive. And then I chose this very powerful image of Sarah that you have seen in the video. Sarah is a maid. She was a maid for a Danish, he was a photographer, but he was also a pharmacist. And he took pictures of everything there. And he also took pictures of Sarah. And as you can see, she doesn't look very content or anything. She looks really, how can I say that? She doesn't look as if she wants to take part in any ball or any party or anything. It says, the title is Sarah in her ball gown. So she looks really resistant. And I wanted to interact with her. I wanted to humanize her, because I feel that she's dehumanized, and her dehumanization shows a lot in this image. So I wanted to, through space and time and history and everything, I wanted to interact with her. And I decided I wanted to invite Leslie Ann Brown, who is African American. She's actually Trinidadian. She grew up in the States and she lived in Denmark for 20 years. She's a writer, and I asked her to write a letter for Sarah. And so she did. She wrote the most beautiful, powerful letter for Sarah. That is the voiceover. That's also Leslie Ann's voiceover that you hear. While you see images of 8 black female, contemporary black female images that are floating in and out of each other. So it's a floating portrait. So it kind of speaks into, of course, the common history and the branching out of the African diaspora, and it just links the future with the past and the present, I think. And it also really it's about connectivity, and that's really a lot about, what my work is about, connectivity within the African diaspora, because I feel very connected to that myself in my work as well as in my private life. And I just felt that this was a very simple way of doing that. And it has this, in a way, uncanny feeling to it, because sometimes you just see like these maybe 4 or 5 pairs of eyes, and then suddenly it's just one person. So it kind of always floats in and out. And it also had this, of course, the gaze as the central figure. So that is a piece that deals with history like very directly with this image that it speaks to, but also with the future and the now, and with the colonial resistance against coloniality.
Thank you so much. One of the things that really is so striking about the gaze now, I mean, you made that piece in 2018, and the figures who are kneeling at the front, of course, that gesture now of taking the knee has another resonance since the death of George Floyd earlier, the murder actually of George Floyd earlier this year. And so it's really, I mean, I guess that's also the quality of the best art, that it somehow continues to speak to the moment in different ways. And I wondered what that sort of meant for you to suddenly find this other layer added to the work because of events in America.
Yeah, I mean, I've been dealing with these issues for a long time, so it's been very present for me as well. I mean, it's been very present all the time, but of course it gets really, I mean, it's heartbreaking that we have to deal with these things still, but it's also, I mean, it's like, yeah, everything has come up to the surface now. I mean, it's been there all the time, but a lot of people have now really seen what it means. And I won't say that I'm happy that people can see that, because it shouldn't be that at all, but it really, it is striking that it has come up and become so visible. And everything is just, I mean, the world is burning now. It's been burning for a long time, but it's really showing. And that's really what I've been trying to deal with in my art, and trying to understand myself, as well as hoping to get my audience to understand. And yeah, I don't know how to explain that. I just feel it's important. It's really important now, as it's been all the time. But more people, I assume, have some kind of consciousness around it right now. There's another consciousness around it than maybe 2 years ago, just 2 years ago. So hopefully we're going in the right direction, or maybe not. I don't know.
Thank you, Jeannette. We're actually missing two of our speakers, I realize. Karen Alexander is not here either. But let us begin to get some impressions, some responses to your work from those who are here. I'll start with Lizzie Collingham. And I'm just going to introduce each speaker very briefly before they say their piece. I can't really do them justice, but please go and look at their work, their biographies, and follow through. I'm sure you'll be inspired to anyway. But Lizzie is an independent writer whose work explores how the minutiae of daily life links to historical events and processes. Her books have illuminated the role of colonialism in shaping, for good and bad, contemporary food culture and identity in the UK and around the world. And Lizzie, I'd like to invite you now to share some thoughts on how you responded to Jeannette's video installations.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the very nice welcome. Thank you, Jeannette. I guess because I'm a food historian, and I talk a lot in my work about agriculture and the way cuisines and food and plants travel around the world, I guess the bit that caught my imagination in your piece, Black is Beautiful, is the description of the slave ships as seed pods. And obviously you were trying to use an image of them as seed pods, seeding these people in other parts of the world. But also, I mean, in a sort of, they're quite literally seed pods, these ships. They brought, the slave ships brought a host of African foodstuffs with them in order to feed the slaves. And these then became part of the agricultural landscape of the countries they were taken to. So the one thing, the foodstuff that's most powerful in many ways is rice. So there's wonderful work by Judith Carney and some about the introduction of rice into the Americas. And the legend is that an African woman hid some rice in the tight curls of her hair and took rice seeds to the Americas. It's probably not true. The rice probably arrived as a foodstuff and got planted. Anyway, the point is that in the 17th century, West Africa was home to a sophisticated system of rice cultivation. Most people tend to think of rice as an Asian foodstuff, but West Africa had which was combined with cattle farming. Then lower down, they had a tidal rice paddies where they harnessed the tide, the river, the tides coming up and down the rivers to irrigate their paddies. And then lower down, they had an ingenious method of building ditches and dikes and I don't know how to call it actually. They're called trunks, so that because they were made out of tree trunks, and then you could let the water in and out if you opened the trunk, and this allowed them to grow rice in the mangrove swamps. And there are lots of descriptions by Europeans who visited the West African coast in the 17th century, describing this incredibly intricate form of rice cultivation. But by the 18th century, this had completely disappeared. The embankments and the canals and all these beautiful trunk networks had all fallen into disrepair. And most of the farmers had disappeared. Either they'd been captured for the slave trade or they'd fled inland to safer places to farm where they wouldn't get caught. And so, but on the other side of the Atlantic, on the South Carolina coast, the swamps of South Carolina had been magically transformed, it seems, into rice paddies. It's as though they picked up a piece of West Africa, not just the people, but just the whole piece of the land, and pushed and took it over to South Carolina. So it's been sort of torn, the people have been torn from their land, but so had the countryside in a way. And so the Carolina planters showed a real preference for Africans slaves who came from this region, Senegambia, around there where all the rice was grown, because they brought their knowledge. Not only did they bring their labor, their very hard labor, digging up all the embankments and up to their waists in water and up to their knees in the mud. It was very hard work, but they also brought all their knowledge and their know-how and transformed these Carolina swamps into rice paddies. So of course, it's the ones who reap the benefits of this. So on the eve of the American Revolution, these rice planters in South Carolina were 4 times richer than Virginia's tobacco planters, 10 times richer than New Englanders. So rice really made them very, very wealthy. But the slaves didn't just bring them the rice to enable them to become wealthy. In a way, African life and African culture intertwined its way into white culture. And you can see this most clearly in the terms of food. They taught the cooks in the kitchen houses, taught the white people how to eat rice. You know, in Britain, people didn't really eat rice as part of their diet, but you'll find letters and so on from planters. There's a lovely letter from the wife of a rice planter to the headmaster of her children. Her 2 boys have gone to school in England. And she explains to him that she sent a big bag of rice for her kids because they like to have rice instead of bread with their food and so on. And this is unusual for England, but it became an absolute staple for the white planters in the Carolinas. But they didn't just bring their rice. They brought, they taught people how to eat okra, sesame seed, and there's a lovely Carolina cookbook which was collected from the ladies of Charleston, and they include in it all kinds of dishes which are clearly from the African diaspora, from West Africa, and they've learned how to cook them from the slaves. So the slaves, for a long time, archaeologists were arrogant and assumed that the pottery they were finding in slave cabins was made by Native Americans and been sold to the Africans. But then an archaeologist who'd been working in Ghana said, no, hang on a minute, these are actually just exactly what you would cook your food in Ghana. They were they brought their pottery skills as well with them. And so the ladies in the Charleston cookbook explain, oh, you have to cook okra soup in a clay pot. It's no good using iron because that allows it to simmer very slowly and the water goes out very slowly. So that is the best way to cook a gumbo. And, when Southern Americans eat hoppin' john, which is black rice, I think. I've never had it like proper in Southern America. But when you eat that for good luck on New Year's Day, and they're eating the culinary legacy of the Africans. So I think it's a good way of exploring how we're here, you're there. That's it's a two-way exchange. It's important to remember that it's not just taking from Africa. The Americans, the slave traders also bring maize from America. With maize becomes a very valuable crop in West Africa because you can grow it 2 crops of maize in the time you can grow 2 crops of millet or sorghum. And that allows you to fill the hungry gap between the millet harvest, the millet being used up and the new harvest coming in. And so maize becomes absolutely integral, and it replaces millet. It displaces millet and sorghum in many areas. And that by now, many Africans, if you told them that maize isn't an indigenous plant in their continent, would be surprised to learn that it had been introduced in the 16th century, just as we think of tomatoes as part of our culture. Or Indians think of chilies as part of their landscape. They think it takes them a minute to realize, oh yeah, they're not really, they come from somewhere else. So I think colonialism and empire, and it's a great engine of transplantation, a violent engine of transplantation, but it's also of agricultural systems, people, landscapes, plants all around the globe. You can see it everywhere. It's not just, I think people forget, it's not just the black diaspora that gets in Newfoundland. You always had molasses, crocks of molasses on the table, and you'd pour molasses on chicken stew or on bread or whatever. But the molasses is obviously from Newfoundland, or flowers or tomatoes or potatoes. They're all integral now in Indian culture. So I think it's very interesting. If nations' human populations are the product of migration, so too are their culinary and cultural identities. And that gives us some hope that there's intermelding and intermixing and through food, which I'm sure Izzy's going to talk about, all the differences and of culture and so on. So that's what my ideas that got flowing.
Thank you, Izzy. It's interesting. It's so ambivalent, this thing with food, which of course is a source of such pleasure and richness in our lives. The fact that we have this tremendous variety and these stories connected to the produce and the ingredients. And at the same time, some of the kind of modes of kind of dominance and exploitation, which were set in motion during the colonial, those centuries of colonial rule and imperial conquest, continue to distort food systems. I mean, if we think of the European Union and the agricultural subsidies, that really skew international food markets and have quite a detrimental effect on markets in Africa, for instance. It's hard to talk about these things being over because they exist in different forms and have different effects. And so I often wonder about how we square these contradictions of, on the one hand, celebrating our food cultures and the diversity in them, and on the other hand, needing to really examine the modes of production that exist, which are still so disadvantageous to so many.
Yeah, I mean, it's cash crops. I mean, it's obviously that, you know, when I was growing up in school, that was the whole thing. So that basically colonial countries were left with basically cash crops, and which caused dependence and so on. That discussion has moved on, and there's different forms of dependence now. It's true. It's very ambiguous. It's very ambivalent. I was at a conference a while ago where I was talking to a lot of chefs from around the world. So they were talking about all of this, and they were all saying, well, in a way, we came to the conclusion that basically, if you understand the story behind a meal, if you can unpack that meal and you can look at the ingredients and you understand the histories and why you're eating these things from, and what stories of violence or not, you know, it can also be happier stories about the transfer of foods and peoples and so on, that understanding the history and knowing the knowledge is part of our way of their way of overcoming these sadder stories. And it's understanding structures and understanding which set of hierarchies are being employed and what you're eating. I think is very important. The first step towards challenging that kind of thing.
Yeah, I guess the question is where we get that information, where we get that knowledge. And yeah, at the moment, it seems more like something that it's not in schools everywhere, for instance, immediately. But maybe also the climate emergency forces us to be attentive in a new way. And then, yeah, we're led to discover other aspects as well. But this is a very good moment for me to turn to Izzy, especially since you're online with us right now. Izzy, can you hear me? Okay, maybe this doesn't work. So maybe we do a slightly different segue and don't stay on this food subject. That's really a pity. Okay, well, let's make a little bit of a jump then and turn to Paul Gilroy. Paul Gilroy is considered one of the leading contemporary theorists on race and racism. He's a founding director of the Sarah Parker Remond Center for the Study of Racism and Racialization at University College London. And he's the author of several seminal books, including The Black Atlantic, Modernity and Double Consciousness. He's known about Jeannette's work for a while and was really somebody that Jeannette especially wanted to be able to talk to about her work in this context. So we're really delighted that you joined us today, Paul.
Well, thank you, Priya, and thank you, Jeannette. I feel privileged to be part of this conversation. I'm really delighted to have been invited. I tried to think about how to respond to Jeannette's amazing work. And of course, I felt I wanted to do something a bit transgressive. It's my impulse. I don't know where the impulse comes from. And I was thinking a lot about how it was presented in a cultural partnership with Scotland. And I was remembering a day walking around the back of the central station in Copenhagen many, many years ago. There was an old record shop there that sold secondhand records. And I was recalling how happy I was because I found a number of records there by the celebrated jazz bagpiper Rufus Harley, an African-American musician who said that as soon as he heard the bagpipes, he knew he had found his instrument. And I didn't bring any of the illustrations with me, but if you look up Scotch and Soul Rufus Harley, you'll see an image of him in his full Highland regalia. Whether it's an invented tradition or not doesn't really bother me. And the figure of Rufus Harley is somebody who always reminds me when he's sitting on my shoulder shouting in my ear or playing the bagpipes into my ear, that culture is mutable, that we don't own it as property, that it flows and travels and has its own rules. And that really the only issue is who dares to make use of it. So I wanted to talk about Scotland a little bit, even though I'm not Scottish. And even though I wanted to, lest we get a bit too binary, remind everybody that this Celtic fringe, so-called, and it's an offensive phrase to some, is a place with its own bitter and bloody colonial history. And I want to try and cook, in a sense, with some local ingredients, some seasonal ingredients. The season of the Westland winds is upon us, and Jeannette's engagement with tyrannic man's dominion is one that connects up with other things in the Black Atlantic world and in Scottish life and history. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Robert Burns and just bring him back, not as the person who who several times turned down the opportunity to go off to Jamaica to be a slave driver come bookkeeper and was saved from that fate by the publication of his first book of poetry. But someone who articulated a kind of profound, I guess what I would call an ecological humanism, and to pick up on some of the pronounced moral sensibilities in his philosophical outlook, which have had a range of effects in the Black Atlantic world from which Jeannette's work comes to us. And of course, Burns' poetry and his outlook was strongly influential over numerous African American fugitives and abolitionists who came to Scotland and spoke there, strengthened in the belief that a man's a man for all that. In particular, maybe he's quite well known to people now, the figure of Frederick Douglass, who spent, I think, 18 months in Scotland and was utterly transformed during his time there. In terms of the expansion of his philosophical viewpoint in the world. And I believe very strongly that Burns is absolutely implicated in that transformation, that his engagement with Burns' work and love of it helps to explain the humanism that sprouted in that Scottish environment inside Douglas. And but you know, a lot of the people that write the stories about Douglas have a different sort of heroic investment in the national story they want to place him in. So they don't really, they'd rather talk about Emerson than about Burns. We know from the pioneering work of a distinguished Scottish historian, George Shepperson, that Douglas' interest in and love of Scotland was something that preceded his tour of Scotland as an abolitionist speaker. And I suppose when I was watching Jeanette's videos, a couple of phrases from the Heaven-Taught Ploughman's famous and complex poem To a Louse came into my mind, particularly the lines, and forgive me those of you who are Scottish for me reading the lines in this way, because I know that's violence in a form. Would some power the gift give us to see ourselves as others see us, to see ourselves as others see us? Well, it seemed to me that what's going on in something of what's going on in Jeanette's work is really about the refusal of that problem. And I think her work celebrates and resists the kind of implication of hypersimilarity or inchangeability that racism specifies. In this work, the Black sees herself being seen and understands, as Fanon did, the revelatory, the alienating force of that epiphany. Jeanette plays with the impact of that disturbing perception, the confusion, the disorientation that follows from facing up to the fact that you've been misrecognized as a Negro. Then Sorda, the same sound that greeted Nella on her peregrinations in Denmark. You know, this work tells me, reminds us that identity is always a work in progress, that it's never finished, that the work of identity is creative and affirmative, and that there is a kind of infinite variability and plasticity to that, contained in what I think of as an open ecological sequence. Here captured in the idea of these Black women in the perhaps not so stiff dress of whiteness, the posture, the shadow behind, the sadness and the sameness and the difference and the differentiation. In the other piece, the gaze of 15 figures, the first with her eyes closed and that drumbeat pulse. It seems to me that there is a lot to be said about this as a different way of dealing with the curse of seeing yourself as others see you, and of being compelled by violence to live your life in relation to theirs. Now, you know, of course, Burns' fluctuating connection to the Caribbean has provided inspiration to a number of other artists too, and that's important to acknowledge. It's important to remember that how many of those African-American travelers made their way to Burns's grave on the banks of the Doon and interacted with his relatives as a matter of pride and piety. And I suppose I also think that Douglas, in his writings on photography, which are not terribly well known, really picks up on this idea of seeing yourself as others see you and inhabiting that, and bringing this into what Douglas called his philosophy of art. So those beautiful lit faces in the gaze affirm this relational being and intersubjectivity. I am here because you were there unfolds into something else. I am because I belong. And both of Jeanette's extraordinary pieces make variation ordinary. They make it unexceptional. There's nothing exotic here about the order of difference that she summons up. It's quotidian. The gaze transcends distance. We share common ancestors. Our organic connection is subject to the contingencies of weather and fortune, the sadness of being ripped away from land and home in such a way that we can never, perhaps, ever be at home again. The last thing that struck me as she was speaking, and it's made a stronger point in my mind by virtue of what she said a moment ago about the curtain in her performance, live performance of the work in its original staging. I was thinking about Amiri Baraka's book, In Our Terribleness. I don't know if you know that book, In Our Terribleness. On the front of In Our Terribleness is a mirror. It's stuck onto the cover of the book. So that as you pick up this book, this poetic work of exploration in art and aesthetics, you know, and this is, I suppose, an artifact of the Black arts movement in its, you know, cultural nationalist phase. You're confronted with a reflection of your own face, which is also judged to be, imagined to be, a collective sign, a portal that's shared. So Baraka's idea of the changing same came into my mind while watching Jeannette's piece, in which that infinite flowing connection between the individual white-clad female bodies prompts questions not only of multiplicity, but of solidarity.
Thank you, Paul. In the text that you wrote and sent us, you dwelt for a little bit longer on something which you mentioned at the beginning of what you said, which was about Scotland's own bloody colonial history. And in your text, you said there are layers of complexity to that story which can be acknowledged without taking anything away from how Scotland has suffered at the hands of England. And it seems to me that this question of holding different histories side by side and being able to look at them is somehow quite essential to the way we would need to look at things today. And yet, how do we look at history side by side? Is there a way to do that without creating hierarchies and sort of, yeah, weighing things up against one another?
Well, yes, obviously there is, and there must be. And if there isn't enough of that, then we have to make more of it happen. I wrote those words before I'd had the opportunity to read Alison's poem. So obviously I would have done it slightly differently if I had thought about that. I felt it was responsible conduct on my part not to start jumping into the romance of Burns and African-American travelers in the Black Atlantic without acknowledging the complexity of his choices and his life and the way in which they symbolize for us you know, the other side. I don't want to make sides. It's just something else and something different in the rich and extraordinary archive of colonial history. So it's not that one supplants the other. One doesn't erase the other. We see them not so much side by side, I guess, but in relation to one another, and that is difficult. Why would it be easy? You know, I mean, why would it be easy? It's not easy to do new things. And of course the danger is, and the flavor of the zeitgeist is one in which we want to make hierarchies of suffering, because the figure of the suffering person is the ultimate prestige object in the mainstream of thought. So the more you can be a victim, the more authority comes into your voice, unfortunately. And you know, whilst I understand how that happens, I hope it's a phase we don't get stuck in. So yes, let's say that we will try, however difficult it seems to be, to see things in relation to one another. And actually, to return to Jeannette's work, I mean, maybe I think I hate making artists speak for their work, because the work shouts louder than they do. And when I was a journalist, I interviewed so many people I admired who made great art or great music or wrote great books, and very few of them had any idea of what they'd done. And that's good as far as I'm concerned. So I suppose I want to say that we have to we just have to strive to do it relationally and not submit or you know, defer to the kind of seduction of competitions in immoral and obscene actually, not just immoral, obscene competitiveness about which groups have suffered most. You know, I mean, I know this is probably not acceptable to say, and I don't know why I'm going to say it, but we all suffer. We're all trapped in the wrong body, and if you haven't found that out yet, you will soon enough. So from my perspective, it's a challenge of living and acting relationally, and seeing the history of empire, seeing the history of colony, seeing the contemporary resurgence of those relationships in forms of neo-imperialism and neo-colonial extractive operations in the world. It's the challenge of seeing those things in relation. And yes, it's really hard.
Yeah, what you said about suffering makes me think of an essay in Sadie Smith's most recent collection, Illuminations, where she talks about suffering and privilege. And she says how suffering can't be measured or sort of regarded in the same way as we look at privilege, that there is something about an individual suffering or a group suffering that one has to sort of recognize and listen to without trying to weigh it up against others' experiences, and that to be able to give that attention, that consideration, is part of a process of somehow finding a way to relate to each other. So
yeah, against the grain.
But,
I guess, can I say something? I guess something about, it's about understanding a history, knowing it, acknowledging it, and then moving on from it, and not holding that as a reason to have resentment. I think that's the challenge, that you should know it. You really need to understand fully where people have come from, how we've got to where we've got to, but then don't use that to judge and carry on. And in the same way that, you know, I think that's the challenge. But anyway,
I don't think I agree with you, and it's good we don't.
No, you don't.
I think it's good not to agree. I hate the sort of piety that creeps in on these occasions where we all end up agreeing with one another. You know, I obviously don't want to defend a kind of melancholic relationship with past suffering, but I also think that, you know, I mean, I can't remember who said it, and it comes up periodically. You know, the past ain't even past. So the question is, the utopia of drawing lines and moving on is not one that I can really entertain. You know, I think, I mean, to sound like the other side of the argument I was just attacking, when I hear the phrase draw a line and move on without rancor, you know, I think of Tony Blair, because he was the one who turned that into a kind of political art, political poetry that I found, you know, obscene also. So I think, you know, I agree in the general sense that we don't want to be stuck in melancholic political relationships, but many people who've done important things in the last, you know, 100 years or so think the opposite, and they think that in order to act politically you have to have some sort of melancholic relationship with that history of suffering, because if you, it's like when the AIDS HIV crisis was at its heart, people said, don't mourn, mobilize. In other words, don't mourn, don't grieve to the end. You can't grieve to the end, but what you can do is adopt a melancholic relationship with that loss that you can use and draw political energy from. So I see that I'm really conflicted about the ethics of drawing lines and moving on.
I guess not drawing lines, but just not holding on to resentments so that all your relations become soured. Toxic, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's the danger. I see the danger, but I don't know the answer to that dilemma.
No, I mean, it's really...
But the thing is, it's also hard not to hold on to resentments if you're continually, you know, having things inflicted on you. Having it
rubbed.
Yeah, it's not that things are over.
No, you have...
Because, like Paul said, because history is not history, it's now. So it's a way of, for me at least, it's a way of understanding my place in the world and the structure of the world. And if I cannot be mad about how things are and has been for a long time, you know.
No, you should be mad about it. I think you should be mad about it. Don't get me wrong.
That's also a way of changing. You know?
Yeah, you have to kind of draw. No, just don't see where you come from, see the injustice, and say, no, I won't accept that, and I'm going to fight for justice. I think that's fair enough. But just, I don't know, dragging the baggage. I guess it's a kind of the way that it's so this is a bit controversial, but so the poppy stuff. So, you know, celebrating war and we all have to wear poppies and so on. But I actually think, no, hang on a minute. I see that as both elites in the whole of Europe using the working class to their own ends, and they were dying. I don't want to celebrate that kind of thing. So I understand it differently. So I don't want with me. I want to say, no, I'm not drawing a line on that. I want to acknowledge exploitation and then look at the exploitation. So maybe I was wrong. Maybe I'm more convinced by you, Paul, but
no, don't be. I mean,
anyway,
I think that's a great example. It's a great example because, I mean, I first heard Alison read in Tavistock Square during the poppy season at I think it was the alternative Memorial Day on you know, the 11th of November, the alternative people gather in Tavistock Square by the Conscientious Objectors Memorial, which is a different Europe actually than the one that's the nationalistic interest that you just described. And I always go to those ceremonies in Tavistock Square because my father was a conscientious objector, and I feel very strongly about maintaining a living link with the right to assert the right not to kill anybody, actually, the right not to kill, to assert the right not to kill. So I heard Alison read there and speak there, and I'm very, I think at this time of year, all of that melancholic stuff, and I've written a book about post-colonial melancholia, so I do see the danger where nationalism gets hold of that process, or especially in its more sort of belligerent forms. Belligerent nationalism gets hold of that and monopolizes that memory, but on the other hand, let's say the problem that we see in that is also a problem that we can find in the annals of the Black Atlantic, where I remember reading, I think it was in Michel Puyo's book about Haiti, him describing a class he was teaching on the history of slavery in Haiti. And the students in the class were saying, we were in the boats, we were there. And actually him saying, well, you know what? I mean, that wasn't you, That wasn't you. You have an imaginative, an emotional, historical, maybe even a cultural link with that history of suffering. But that wasn't you. So you need to be able to critically address what form of identification is being sort of sutured in the substitution of yourself for that person in the hold of the slave ship. So I think it names a problem, but it doesn't solve the problem.
I think Jeannette put her finger on it, though, when you say you're a possible me in the past and I'm a possible you in the future. I mean, that's the kind of level of, identity. It's I guess what I was trying to say is hold on to the complexity, understand where your injustices come from, but then, I don't know, don't use the anger from now and the complexity of now rather than dragging the complexities of past. But anyway, I don't know.
Yeah, of course, that's a good way of looking at it. But the complexity of now is created by the complexity.
Yes, yeah. You've got to understand the past, obviously.
I think it's difficult because we can't think and experience strong emotions at once, and a lot of the racist narratives produce emotion which prevents you thinking rationally and being able to hold complexity. As a Scot, I mean, I remember growing up in Scotland that was all the melancholia and the angriness and the we are hard done by and the sad songs and the angry songs, which obviously is kind of, it's utterly unnuanced, it's idiotic, it doesn't have the detail you need. Obviously, you've got the idea that you can't think about wrongdoing in the past because this is somehow collective punishment for past deeds, and obviously that's impossible. And then immediately, as a white person, I can leap to, oh well, that's not fair. And obviously, the dialogue you want to be having, the narrative that you want to be going through is, what about collective responsibility in the present and in the future? And for that, you just need the understanding of the past. And you need to be able, this is what's so wonderful about looking in somebody's eyes. You need to be able to look clearly, and you need to be able to, go through the details so that you can see where you can go wrong and you can see where you go right. And, as a Scot, I know Robert Louis Stevenson went to the west, to Samoa, and absolutely embraced the indigenous people there, helped the indigenous people there, wrote initially censored long short stories about the wrongdoing of the empire, of how it was international theft, of how it was internationally spreading venereal disease. I mean, he completely saw it clearly, but equally, I know, I don't like looking up at the Union Jack because that flew above so many countries and must have made so many hearts drop and so many stomachs turn. But equally, if I look up at the Saltire, you kind of think, oh well, that's a clean flag. And of course, it's not a clean flag because it's the flag of the South. It's why the flag of the South is a Saltire. It's why the flag of Jamaica is a Saltire. you know, and I have to understand that to be a healthy, responsible person who can go forward into the future and behave humanely, and understand that, you know, I was taught at school about the clan with the C and about the fiery cross gathering the clan. At some point, I have to learn that the clan with a K was gathered with a fiery cross and was an obscenity coming from a sort of mythical idea. And then I become a safe person. And I have to understand that it's weird. The same forces that will say these people are not human, these people are not human, so they can be destroyed. There's also an acknowledgement that all humans are human. So, you know, for example, you can invade Namibia, you can make it a vast, open, you know, an entire country that's just a concentration camp, while saying, well, these Namibian people, they have black skin, so they're not really human. So it's fine. You just give them a number and you let them die and you mutilate them. It doesn't matter. But the next generation, then they take that to Europe. And at the moment, we're saying it doesn't matter if brown-skinned people drown, if their countries are on fire, if they can't cultivate their crops. You know, the world is now telling us, no, you can't let those human beings die, because eventually Europe will be underwater and on fire. But that logic of it's okay to destroy disabled people, but then it always moves on. It always moves on. And the history of the last 20 years in the UK is this rapid acceleration of who it's okay to kill. And if we don't get a grip of that, obviously it will end terribly badly. But as a Scot, it's interesting to be of a people who went out as religious fundamentalists and just murdered people, and a people, now if I wear a kilt, I'm wearing a kilt, which is a native costume, but it was appropriated by the occupying army that took native people away to then be used in colonial forces. It's very complicated, but it's fascinating, and it has to be known in order for me to be a reasonable person and just stand in my own skin and meet other people who are slightly different or completely the same, or whatever. But just the only other thing I'd say, I love that this is so based in food, because it's so fundamental, it's so visceral. It's the smell of your mother, it's the smell of your mother's kitchen, it's the smell of your house. It literally short circuits the rational bits of your brain, goes straight to emotion. And the fact that I can eat someone else's food and then my skin will smell like their skin. Mm-hmm. This is why it so freaks out racists, and they fish and chips is ours and we've only ever eaten fish and chips. No, this is Portuguese and Spanish Jewish food. Freaks them out. And I love that you can get in at that level and say, no, look, a friend of mine, Giles Dooley, who's a photographer, had a project where he took Syrian people fleeing horrific conflict and just put an equal number of people from elsewhere in a space in London, and just let people know people as people. A 5-minute walk from my house, there's a Syrian restaurant. People who fled oppression came through Glasgow through the wonderful refugee project, and now they're giving Syrian food to people who aren't Syrian, and being at home while they're not at home, and bringing people into their home. And that's it's really powerful, because it's a human thing. You can't argue with it. It's just human.
Yeah, that's a little bit what Soul Food Sisters is about too.
Yeah.
And so sorry, Lisa isn't here to talk about it herself, but that this collective of immigrant women use their kind of expertise and knowledge and of all these wonderful different cultures and cuisines to then reach out into the community, particularly to those who are most structurally vulnerable, and to use the food as a starting point for caring and sharing. And it is really powerful. It is really beautiful. I'm wondering here if food kind of hasn't got isn't having a sort of insidious joke on colonialism in a certain way, because it has managed to sort of infiltrate and get into parts of us and convince us that it's very much ours, in inverted commas, even though of course it has very different traces and origins, and there's something quite beautiful about that ingredients can sort of enter us in this way and enter our lives.
Well, when a Southern American takes a piece of cornbread and he or she mops up the pot liquor at the bottom of a pan of greens, that's what West Africans would have been doing as well. And it's a very subtle way of undermining. Yeah, I mean, the sad thing is that British people eat curries, think curries are theirs, and yet they would go to the Indian restaurant and still be abusive to the people whose food they were eating. So that, it's not just because you eat multiculturally doesn't mean you think multiculturally, but it is a joke on people, I think, in a way that, they are eating somebody else's food and they are absorbing their culture, whether they like it or not.
But Alison, I love what you said. Sorry.
No, go on, Jeannette.
Okay. I love what you said about the smell, that when you eat someone else's culture, that you smell of that culture. It's just like history. Our bodies smell of history. They contain history. It's in our DNA, and I just feel that it's very that one of my new pieces deal with that actually, where I use hair as a marker for that, and also a marker for connectivity. So it's all layered in our bodies. It's right there. So I think it's really a very important note there.
And it's odd how it's moved. I mean, I can't remember the play, but there's a line in a David Hare play about, it's something like the smell of curry drifting over neighbour gardens. And it's just this, at that point, huge shorthand for, oh my God, there are foreigners. And yeah, absolutely, you can eat curry and still be vile to the person serving it to you. But it's interesting that it's sort of moved, that, across towns, you could be next to my house and you have the smell of curry drifting. So the foreignness has crept in despite you. But yeah, I mean, it's not a cure until it sort of soaks into your brain somehow.
Paul,
Alison, sorry, Jeannette.
No, Paul wanted to say something.
Well, it's on a different thing. I was thinking about Alison was denouncing the sort of sentimental and melancholy aspect of invented Scottishness in the 19th century and I was thinking it's precisely that quality which makes it so engaging to the African Americans who come in. So we have to be a bit careful we don't throw the baby out of the bathwater. I mean, Douglas writes that's the basis of his. I mean, okay, there are other things about Burns that he really likes. He likes Tam O'Shanter, and a lot of the sort of more precious abolitionists, some of the sort of proto-feminist voices in the abolitionist sort of circuit recoil from his enthusiasm for that particular poem. So he has to write a sort of long apology in a letter explaining why he's completely kind of committed to those sides of Burns as well as the other more respectable ones. So I just wanted to say that really, and think about how unruly these cultural forms are, and how gloriously they resist being sort of owned and disciplined by anybody really.
Alison, could we take this moment to just come to your response to Jeannette's artworks, which was so moving and so powerful. I wish in a way that you could read some of it now, because I feel really bad for our audience that we talk about something which they don't know, and which I feel, in a way, I also feel like that piece was made to be said. And that I would love to see you. I mean, would you be able to spontaneously read it to us? Would that be very odd?
I have it spontaneously to hand, which would suggest a lack of spontaneity. Yeah, I mean, this sort of is a response to lots of things in the air. But I'm just there are multiple verses, but I'll just sort of read the verse about Scotland, which was probably being referred to. And obviously, as a Scottish writer, I can't forget that Robert Burns wrote The Slave's Lament, which was an unusual thing at the time. So the whole poem's called Look at Me How, and this idea, again with the gaze, this idea that the white skin will always demand to be looked at and listened to in this way that is toxic for everybody, including the person. Look at me how I am Celt white, Scot white, how the shape of my flag haunts Jamaica because of chains, rises over the south whenever it yearns for screaming, how the fire cross that gathered as summons the noose, the clan stumbles into blood nights, one letter metastasizing. Look at the color of people who were cleared and then clearing, underfoot and then treading down. The pure broad sang over stolen earth as an empire's cry for more, the turn of the sun always seeing our sins. We were the victimizing victims. Look how the blood washed from the cotton and tobacco, but never the debt. It's just my skin, what I was born with. I never knew it was a nightmare thing.
One thing that struck me as I was reading that made me think of something a friend said to me not long ago. She mentioned Donna Haraway and the modest witness, and this idea that to voluntarily enter the difficult life circumstances of another, to take on that role of a vulnerable observer, has kind of can hold all the power of humanity. And of course, in this case, it's not just being a witness because you're also implicating yourself. But it seemed to me that there was something of this kind of modesty in the way that you stepped forward in that poem to sort of stare at yourself and then step back again at the end, as if, you know, where you say that, you know, why look at me, that there's more pain elsewhere. And yet there's this recognition that this needs to be said, this needs to be acknowledged before I then step back again. I wondered how you respond to that idea of a modest witness.
Yeah, and in a way, if you write any kind of literary fiction, hopefully you're creating empathy, and this practice of, you know, the detail of pretending to be somebody else or entering into somebody else, which is this sort of non-sociopathic art form, which is why it's so important to have, you know, acted drama and fiction rather than everything being, you know, constructed reality and non-factual writing that seems to be initially credible. But I think, you know, it's very careful, and it's a thing to be very careful about, and what I was trying to avoid in the story, because if you can't engage in a victim off, another way you can get sidelined is by having an emotion off, and then suddenly it's, oh, I've discovered the plight of the Haitian people. Oh, I've discovered the plight of the people tortured in the Congo by the rubber traders, or oh, I've discovered now the difficulty of the people in the Congo because of the demand for elements for mobile phones, and so I'll be very sad about it, which does nothing other than to make you very sad, and it's not real sadness because it isn't happening to you. And this thing of I will be emotionally indulgent, it's almost as repulsive a thing as the kind of the idea of a Karen screaming at somebody because she's more entitled to whatever it is. It's unhelpful, but it feels beguiling, and it feels as if you're immediately doing something. So it's, you know, you have to think, when is it appropriate to do what, and am I helping anybody? And a lot of the, I don't know, maybe because young people become activists, which is wonderful, but they're also quite emotional and hormonal. Maybe some of that energy gets lost in emotion. Maybe because I'm old and crumbly, I'm less emotional now.
No, there's definitely no less emotional in your writing. It's just it just always takes different registers, I think, and that ability.
You begin with fury, and it's a useful fury, but it can't just burn through you, and it certainly can't be, look at me, I am having a greater grief than the grief of somebody torn from their homeland with relatives lost and relatives dead in a dreadful airless boat with no room to move, and then in another country with all the rights of a piece of farm machinery. I can't have that grief. I can have fury about that, but it has to be useful fury, or I don't even really have a right to that fury for very long.
Am I in the version I saw? The piece was called "The Common Breath." Is that still the title? Because I was.
It's published by The Common Breath.
Ah, okay. Because
the piece is called "Look at Me How," but it's published by The Common Breath, which is a very nice little publishing company. But certainly it's about, and I think the ethics of the company are about human beings having a common breath and doing something useful with it.
Because for me, that then echoed also with the kneeling gesture in Jeannette's work, and the recent events, and these sort of echoes, the way in which I think we take what's around us, and then it's expressed out of us differently. I think that's so powerful and so beautiful. And that's what, for me, has been really amazing about people coming together and these different perspectives joining through Europe's Kitchen. And I wanted to ask you about this, Jenna, actually, because one of the characteristics of your work in those two installations that we see is that you appear in them, but you always appear with others. Mm-hmm. And I think this is also a general approach in your work. And you mentioned connectivity, but it seems to me there's something very important about this appearing with others. And I wondered if you could talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that happened in my laser pieces, because I also did performances with only me. But actually, since the gaze, I have been performing with others and found a very great inspiration, and also it's been very powerful to work with others and to create new knowledge and new images and new visions, and it's been really helpful to me. And I also feel that it has been needed in my work. It's been very I've been very drawn to an actual connectivity, I think. In different ways. Like I said before, maybe I should show the new pieces that I have, where you can see another form of connectivity. Is that okay?
Yes, please.
Okay. So I just need to know how I share my screen.
I think that screen button at the bottom.
Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah. Oh.
But seems to be off at the moment, or at least for me it is.
Yeah, I cannot do it. I mean, anyways, okay.
But I mean, one of the things about, of course, having appearing with others is that immediately this idea of multi-perspectives and multiplicity is suggested. And talking about your new project, I mean, hopefully you can show to us. I don't know if our host can maybe, Manuel can maybe give you a tip on how to do that. But you mentioned, is this the project with the Thorvaldsen Museum that you're doing?
Yeah, for instance, that's one of them. Yeah. I can shortly, sorry.
Well, I just thought this was a very interesting example of working together, because I saw in this interview that you did about it, that you're doing it with your husband. But in that interview, you said you were invited to create a joint work, but you decided that you couldn't do that because you have very different positions. But that you would create your own works, and then you would meet in a discussion. And this seemed to me a very sort of interesting and revealing, because obviously your husband is somebody you share a lot with and are really close to, and yet so do you want to tell us about what this project has asked you to do and why you couldn't work together?
Yes, of course. Thorvaldsen's museum in Denmark celebrates the work of Bertel Thorvaldsen, who was a sculptor from 1700s. He's one of the most famous Danish sculptors. And the museum invited us to create a joint piece in relation to an exhibition called Face to Face, where they're celebrating the 250 years of his birth. And they also wanted to reactivate Thorvaldsen's portraits. So they invited us with the word ancestry. So we should relate to the word ancestry. And for me, of course, as I already mentioned, it means a lot. It means a lot because of history and because of, I mean, for my practice but also in my personal life. And my husband, he's Danish. he has like a straight ancestor in the museum. One of his ancestors, a German woman. She was like a cultural person in Germany, and she had her portrait made by Thorvaldsen. So she's right there, like in marble and everything. So which is of course a very interesting starting point for the two of us. But we have such different positions in that, because my ancestors are not there, although they were able, I mean, with their suffering, I'm not really, I don't want to use that word right now, but that's the only word I can think of. This museum or Thorvaldsen's work wouldn't be there, because he was supported by one of the biggest slave owners in Denmark. So, and all the money came from, all the wealth came from from that industry. So it really kind of, yeah, the people who made this are not represented there. So they're my ancestors. So I created this piece that talks about that, but also talks about the connectivity within the diaspora then as well as now. So what I did, I created a space. I got this space by myself, in which a sculpture was normally seen, a sculpture of Cupid and Psyche, but they moved it for this exhibition. So there's only the plinth left. And then from the floor and up, I put hair, black hair, afro hair, yeah, to cover the floor, but cover it for like 60 centimeters. So it looks like, I don't know how you can say it. I mean, you should have seen it. I don't know how we can do this, because
maybe we can put an image on the website afterwards, if we
okay.
Yeah, okay. So that people know what you were referring to.
Okay, yeah. The reason why I decided to create like a this type of installation is because in the museum there's a black board all around the museum, like kind of a fundament of the museum is a black board. And when I saw that, it's like, wow, this is so symbolic. This museum, this whole thing is built on black bodies, on black workers. So I used that as a starting point, and then I thought to myself, how can I emphasize this, and how can I also connect with my own experience, my own work, what I do. So that's how I came into the idea of using hair, but also as an indicator of the DNA, as I was talking about before, because in the DNA it's a portrait, so it's another way of making a portrait and reactivating the idea of portraits as they wanted in the museum. They wanted to reactivate portraits. So that was one of the ways that I approached this project. I was also thinking about scientific racism that was, of course, established around that time with Carl von Linnaeus and all these people at that point, because one of the sculptures that Thorvaldsen also made was of an Indian king. And the only way you could tell that he was Indian was of his name, because his features were very white, and yeah, you couldn't really tell. So that also made me think, what did that mean? I mean, why is it so? What does it say about the ideal features and the ideal, you know, all these things? And then I tapped into the idea of, or the notion of scientific racism, which I had been dealing with before, but it kind of, there's a lot of traces there.
Yeah, it's amazing.
But also with, I mean, today, and the way the installation appears can also be seen as like an ocean of hair. So it also made me think, of course, of what's going on in the Mediterranean. Yeah, so it kind of goes in and out of history and now and
yeah. I mean, like all your work, there's so many levels. It's incredible. And one of the things you said in this interview was that this question of who gets to know their family and their heritage, and who gets to feel that as something very concrete and heavy and tangible. And then the others like you, where it's very scattered and fragmented, and then you're trying to kind of build that and for it to have a weight that is comparable in a certain sense, so that it's recognized, so that it's visible. I mean, it's about visibility in a different way.
Yeah, representation and visibility, of course. Yeah, very much. But it's also interesting that that my husband, who is, like I said before, Danish, and he has his ancestor right behind him in the interview, actually, he doesn't really feel connected at all with this woman or with his ancestry. Whereas me, and I think it happens for a lot of Black people, we are so, I mean, the ancestors are so deeply embedded in our consciousness and our beings. And yeah, so although we don't have, you know, we don't see them like right there, but they are so, their spirits are inside of us. So I think that's really interesting. And it also speaks about positions and privileges in a different way. And that was what we were going to, that was our joint project. And we were going to do a talk about why we could not make a joint project. So we did. Yeah. Although my husband, he made a project that dealt with his ancestor and with the marble that she was created in. And then he turned it over to talk about the heavy uses of using of resources, and like taps into the same kind of issues that I'm speaking about, but from a different perspective. So yeah, that's quite interesting.
Also, this kind of productive negotiation of difference that you manage, which it just seems to me like that's something that's so urgently needed in our politics and in our societies right now, the ways in which we can navigate differences better. Because as Alison said, there's just so much emotion and not enough space to breathe and reflect and think of some other way to find common ground or reach an understanding in which we can somehow all at least tolerate each other. We are coming into the last few minutes of the discussion, and I just wondered if any of you would like to just offer a last reflection or any last thoughts before we go. Do we have any questions
from the audience? Or
as far as I can see, no. If anyone has any questions, please quickly type them in and we can ask. I should have asked you that at the beginning. So if you do have thoughts or reflections that you want to share, even as we come to the end, please send them in anyway, and we would then share them with all our participants, because I really do feel that other thoughts and questions really open up other angles on things and also show our own blind spots. And it would be really nice to see how you're responding out there, seeing as we have no idea who you are or where you are. It's almost like we were having a little chat really in someone's kitchen. It felt very intimate here.
I would like to say thank you really for creating this platform, because I think it's been really very interesting and fruitful. And it's a format that I haven't done this before in this way, but I think it's been such such a fruitful conversation, and some very beautiful and very powerful contributions. Thank you, Alison, Lizzie, and Paul. It's been really, really, fantastic. I'm very grateful and humble of your contributions and what you have been reflecting on, and in terms of or in relation to my work, and thank you so much.
Thanks for the work. It was amazing.
It's a real pleasure. It's a real pleasure. I'm about to go and cook an aubergine dish, which I learned from a Syrian refugee chef. So I feel like I'm, trying to integrate different cultures. gaze at myself differently. And I really enjoyed your work. So it's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeannette, for the opportunity. Thank you, Priya, for sharing. And thank you, Lizzie and Alison, for the pleasure of listening to you. I'm really, really grateful to have had the chance to participate today.
Yeah, and thank you also to our audience. Nice to know you were with us. And Jeannette, I have to say, your openness and generosity in coming into this project was really inspiring, and it has opened up all these, I mean, so many people have been touched by this, all the ones who got meals through Soul Food Sisters. I think there are many different levels on which people have connected with your work, and it's going to be available online for a few more weeks, I think, which we're really, really happy about and feel very lucky to be able to host your work that way. Mm-hmm. So please, if you haven't looked at it, do send it, share it to people, share it with others, and yeah, send us your remarks and thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And I would also like to thank my colleague Eva Maria Kleinschwätzer, who was in touch with our wonderful colleagues at the Goethe-Institut in Glasgow and other partners who made this happen. It's just, these kind of things only happen because there are many people involved and who are really, yeah, making the connections and doing the work behind the scenes. And so thank you to all of you. Yeah.
Thank you, Priya.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you to you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Take care.